Mary took the opportunity to have a moment of a shout out, and I want to take the opportunity to have a moment of shout out too, because we have two previous presidents with us today who were presidents, I think, when a number of these speakers were here as students. Dory Friend in the front row and David Fraser in the back row. So, Dr. Campbell, that was a fabulous presentation, and I think we should rename the whole conference, not the future of the liberal arts, but let's make world makers. And that's certainly a part of this session. We want to talk about the future of knowledge, how we talk about it in the liberal arts, how it changes, how it evolves. We have four distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce each panelist in the order they will speak. And then each one is going to spend about a minute and a half and just introduce themselves via their experience of learning at Swarthmore. Then we'll go back to the beginning. They'll give 7-minute presentations, have some conversation, and then open it up to questions and answers. Rebecca Bushnell, class of '74, is the former dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's currently a professor of English. She writes and teaches about the genre of tragedy and early modern English culture. Rebecca is the author of 7 books and has received numerous awards and prizes. This year, Rebecca is serving as the president of the Shakespeare Association of America. Sean M. Decatur, on my right, class of '90, became president of Kenyon College on July 1st of last year, after serving as the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Oberlin. He was also a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at Oberlin. Sean is the author of numerous scholarly articles and has received a number of national awards for his scholarship. Ellen L. Schall, class of '69, is the Martin Cherkosky Professor of Health Policy and Management at NYU Wagner and a Senior Presidential Fellow at NYU. She served as the Dean of NYU Wagner from 2002 to 2013, during which time she led the school from an institution with a strong local and regional reputation to one that is now widely recognized nationally and internationally. Her leadership focuses on, her research focuses on leadership and organizational transformation. Ellen began her career as a Legal Aid Society criminal defense attorney and served as the commissioner of the NYC Department of Juvenile Justice from 1983 to 1990. Philip J. Weiser, class of '90, is the dean of the University of Colorado Boulder Law School and the executive director and founder of the Silicon Valley Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado. He rejoined the Colorado faculty in 2011 after serving as the senior advisor for technology and innovation to the National Economic Council director at the White House. Prior to that, Philip served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice Antitrust Division. He has written and taught in areas of competition policy, innovation policy, and internet policy. He has co-authored 3 books and, like all of our other panelists, has received numerous awards and fellowships. So we're thrilled to have our panelists with us today to help us discuss this incredibly important question about where knowledge is and where it's headed in the liberal arts. But first, let's get to know the panelists a little bit. Rebecca, how about you? How'd you learn at Swarthmore?
Well, so first, what did I learn at Swarthmore?
How did you learn?
How did I learn? Well, that's interesting because I think more than anything what Swarthmore fed was my hunger to learn, almost indiscriminately. You know, it never stood in my way and it never held me back in saying, what's the next thing you want to know? Now, when I was here, one thing I was obsessed with learning as many literatures and languages as I could. And I actually want to make a shout out here to Gil Rose. who was my teacher then and who made it seem as learning ancient Greek was the most important thing you could ever do in your life. And he was right. So I'm going to admit I also found some very clever ways when I was here to get around the breadth requirements. For example, I took linguistics instead of mathematics. And now I deeply regret this to all the mathematicians in the room, and I've spent a lifetime trying to redress the fact that, when I was here, I was able to get around doing some of these kinds of things. But I think if there's anything I also learned at Swarthmore and that was an important habit for a life of success, is I learned how to learn new things. So right now, for example, I'm actually sitting in on a freshman math class. I'm co-teaching a course on reality with a mathematician and a scholar of Islam. And so I'm learning math all over again. But this also teaches you it's never too late, and that's what Swarthmore taught me.
Thank you. John?
Now, when I think about how I learned at Swarthmore, the first thing that comes to mind is problem solving in all contexts. And so that included work in the classroom. It included a lot of work in the lab where I've had the opportunity to collaborate with faculty, with students to do everything from figure out how to rebuild a vacuum pump to figure out a larger context of a problem we were working on. But I'm also amazed at how those same things translated into all of my work outside of the classroom. And so problem solving in the context of working with community organizations in Chester, with organizing students on campus. I think all of it sort of comes down to a sense of being, I think in reflecting what Dr. Campbell talked about, a sense of being willing to take risk and kind of resilience of things when they fail, and the coming out of or emerging from that process with a real strong sense of optimism that with enough effort and with enough creativity and enough conversations, you could do anything. And that was the really my take-home lesson from Swarthmore.
Great.
So the most important thing I learned at Swarthmore, and I was here from 1965 to 1969, was that race mattered. I learned, a lot of other things. I was underprepared academically, so I learned how to think, I learned how to read, I learned how to write, how to broaden my horizon. But from the moment I came to Swarthmore from a public high school in Wilmington, Delaware, and I came with the notion that we were aspiring to build a world that was race blind. It was a liberal notion. It was one I carried with me. It seems remarkably naive now, but it's how I arrived. And it's one of those lessons that race matters that I learn over and over again. I learned it the summer of the year before my freshman year when I got a letter from the college telling me that my roommate was Negro. And this was a fact that had to be imparted to me, struck me as strange. And when I got here and shared that with her, we marched down to the Dean of Students and had a big conversation. But from that moment and through all the difficulties and from the time that the black students occupied the admissions office to the moment that Courtney Smith died to the moment I was standing in Clothier Hall as president of the Student Council, helping the community try to make sense of what had happened historically and currently, the community of purpose that Swarthmore was and is, the set of values it represented, and the willingness to hold tough conversations is really one of the things for which I'm most grateful.
Go.
So I picked two things. One is a love of learning, and the second was feeling empowered. On the love of learning, Hayward Hale Broom, sportscaster, spoke at our graduation and said that he came to Swarthmore and learned the value of lifelong learning and has been paying the price ever since. And that is something I reflect on a lot. The other person who spoke, I just remember, was Robert Putnam. This is actually before Bowling Alone. And he had also talked about Swarthmore empowering him in terms of his focus on public service. And there were a number of experiences that I had here that were outside the classroom, some of which with Janet Dickerson, who was the dean at the time, other mentors, role models, Chris Edley, who's the chair of board of managers, that reinforced that there's a lot that I could do as a leader. And having that experience while here was incredibly powerful, because when I got out, I didn't have any sense of barriers for people I was going to interact with. And so I had the attitude that I can talk to anybody. And I took that for granted until looking back and realized how a lot of people who had different college experiences are very intimidated, are very reluctant to take the initiative, are disempowered. And so both the love of learning that I got at Swarthmore pervaded the environment here, but even more importantly, feeling empowered as a citizen and a leader stayed with me.
Terrific. So Rebecca, why don't you start us off with the future of knowledge? Where's the liberal arts headed?
Well, so as part of this conversation, in particular in preparing my remarks and thinking about what the subject of this symposium, I wanted particularly to address the problem of the division between the liberal arts and professional training. And in my part of this, to address the future of the humanities and how the humanities can continue to flourish in a world that seems to be increasingly dismissive of its value. And I am the humanist, besides you, in this room. And this is something that I'm acutely aware of, having served as a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania for over 30 years, and as a dean for 15, at an institution where arts and sciences sits surrounded by 11 professional schools, and where a particular undergraduate business school called Wharton looms, literally and symbolically, large over the College of Arts and Sciences. Penn is a place where the fine arts major has to defend him or herself daily to the finance major. There is no place to hide at Penn. So in my brief remarks, and I want to make a case for innovation in the humanities that connects it to the world of work. And this is somewhat related, I think, to what we just heard about connecting the arts to liberal arts education, and I want to talk about the humanities in practice. Now, I will never cease to believe in the value of humanistic study for its own sake, but I want to argue that our humanists, our writers, our philosophers, our classicists should start thinking about having a vocation of their own in a world that demands a vocation or professional training. I want them to learn to connect the inherently valuable work of thinking to the work of doing. So part of the background for the conversation today is, of course, the sense that liberal arts are in danger, that they're under a pressure in a world that increasingly demands not just the kind of relevance that we used to talk about in the 60s and 70s, but a relevance that equates with jobs or career training. And the pressure is really on from the president, not you, but the other president, Barack Obama, on down to parents and students to focus on accountability and outcomes. You may have heard recently about the flap that Obama had when he spoke dismissively of art history. But let's be frank about it. I really do believe that much of the current assaults against a liberal arts education are really about the humanities. It's about questioning the humanities. So I'm just going to put one example on the table from a New York Times article in 2009 by Patricia Cohen. And here's how the article opens. One idea that elite universities like Yale, sprawling public systems like Wisconsin, and smaller private colleges like Lewis and Clark have shared for generations is that a traditional liberal arts education is by definition not intended to prepare a student for a specific vocation. That's sentence one. Sentence two, rather the critical thinking, civic and historical knowledge, and ethical reasoning that the humanities develop have a different purpose. They are prerequisites for personal growth and participation in a free democracy, regardless of career choice. Now, what interests me from that article is the slippage from sentence one to sentence two. This is what we humanists do. In the discussion of the liberal arts to the humanities, as if the liberal arts were really just the arts part. So Cohen implicitly links the traditional liberal arts non-vocational definition to the goals of the humanities: critical thinking, civic and historical knowledge, ethical reasoning. But these, it has been made clear, they're just not enough these days. Now, having been in this business for the long haul, I have seen the attacks against the humanities shift in about the last 20 years. Now, there was a time at the peak of the culture wars, when the humanities were accused of corrupting the traditional liberal arts education, when they abandoned the traditional great books approach in a mindless search for relevance, putting African American studies over classics, multicultural over Western culture, popular over high culture, or when, in the words of Joseph Epstein in an article in the Weekly Standard, they determined that race, gender, and social class were at the heart of all humanities and most social science subjects. And with that finishing touch, he said, the game was up for the liberal arts. But we don't hear as much these days from the conservative critics of the humanities for seeming to be too relevant, chasing after those contemporary issues and ideas, because honestly, the rest of the world is anxious about their not being relevant enough in a different way, that they have no real usefulness in this world. So why worry about what we're teaching in English if people are abandoning English for those practical disciplines of computer science or economics so that they can get a job? Who cares? Now let me be clear here to start. I believe passionately in all the things that everyone talks about when they come to the defense of an education in the humanities. Writing and communication skills, critical thinking, a sense of the past, creativity, wisdom, broad cultural understanding. You don't need to hear me repeat this, and I think everyone in this room, I hope, would share those values. Instead, in the short amount of time I have remaining here, I'm going to suggest that to survive and flourish, and to sustain the idea of a liberal arts as a whole, thinking and education in the humanities needs to be more clearly connected to the world. I think it's time to start thinking about the humanities as work in the world. We don't have to abandon reading and writing, talking about ideas, arts, history, the human condition, but at the same time, I think we need to get our humanists to work in the world in a way that is understood by everyone. And indeed, there is a lot of work to be done in all sorts of different kinds, directly connected to the qualitative disciplines, you might say. There's a vast economy out there invested in the production and analysis of art, writing, entertainment, design, history, culture, both online and offline. Even in an age when cultural institutions and traditional forms of writing seem to be disappearing, they're being replaced by other things. So what are some practical solutions? First, I think student research in the humanities needs to be promoted and supported in the same way that we do research in the support research in the sciences and social sciences. We need to put kids in our labs. While communication and writing skills will never cease to be critical to undergraduate research, I think we also need to respond to a changing world of digital data accumulation and analysis. Our students already naturally inhabit that digital world, but they need the tools to navigate it. I believe our humanists should be learning programming skills and tools for digital analysis and data analysis and have the opportunity to practice those skills. Second, we need to give our students the opportunity to literally practice the kinds of humanities work they do, both in the classroom and outside. Now at Penn, the place I know best, we have several successful experiments of this kind which have really revitalized, I think, the humanities. Our students love them, parents love them, and they make the case for humanistic work. So for example, for about a decade now, we've offered a series of curatorial seminars through our Department of History of Art, where in a semester or year-long process, students study a subject like contemporary art or Afro-Brazilian art. But then they undertake the work of curating an exhibition in one of our museums, the Institute for Contemporary Art of the Penn Museum. They are given a budget. They're given money, and they're said, here's the amount of money you have to spend. Now go out and make this thing work. Make it happen in the world. In another sphere, we have a series of funded writing apprenticeships where a student is assigned to a professional writer to work together on a project. So this apprenticeship is not like an independent study, but rather the goal of the program is to expose students to the work of real writers in the real world and have them acquire the skills that it takes to bring something from conception to publication. And finally, we've built a program of summer-funded research internships for humanities students in Penn and Philadelphia cultural institutions, museums, libraries, presses. These are the humanities equivalents of those summer research experiences in the science labs, where our students participate in projects with the mentorship of museum and library and publication professionals. So these are just 3 examples, I think, of a multitude of ways in which I believe we need to innovate, to integrate the work of thinking, which is so critical to us, and which I believe so profoundly with the work of doing. And I really think that what we humanists love to do, to debate, to think, to read, to write, to observe, to analyze, is not antithetical to the work and to a life of practice. It grounds a life of practice. So for those of us who are teachers in the humanities, embracing this kind of innovation may mean learning to do things new ways and to teach differently. But I'll remind you how I started in telling you how Swarthmore fed my desire to learn and to always learn new things. So I'm ready, and I hope a lot of you are ready too.
Okay, Sean.
And I'd actually like to echo some of the same themes, but broaden out really from the humanities to across the spectrum of disciplines in the liberal arts. And maybe first taking a step backwards, when I think of the goals of a liberal education, one of the sort of works that comes to mind is actually a sermon that was given by Martin Luther King back in April of 1967. It was called The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life. And he describes in his terms the length and the width and the height of a life, where the length is the notion of self-development and development of self to one's maximum capabilities, discovering your passions and being able to hone them intellectually and in practice. The second is a sense of empathy and connection to community and those around you, and an understanding that one's own work and one's own life is intricately connected to the lives of others around us. And the third is a larger spiritual notion of understanding of where one's place in the universe lies. And so and a respect and an awe for the relationship between people and all of the things that surround us. And I very much think that those are the main goals that we have when I think of what the goals of an undergraduate education. It's to help to launch the development of a student along all 3 of those paths. And we certainly find a lot of that in the traditional classroom and courses of study. And indeed, that's what study in the arts and the humanities and social and natural sciences really aims to bring about. And you find bits and pieces of all 3 of those dimensions through the study of all of those disciplines. And there are great works of art, there are great texts, there are great science problems that help to nurture that within students. But what I'd like to echo, and this really builds on the types of innovations that were just discussed, are what happens outside of the classroom and what are other types of pedagogical approaches which are also essential to ensure student development in all 3 of those dimensions and all 3 of those paths. And we can think of as complements to the traditional outcomes of the ability to communicate in written and oral form, the ability to solve problems, the ability to analyze text. Those are the classic canonical outcomes that we look for liberal education. I would add to those the ability not only to rigorously challenge ideas and rigorously interrogate ideas, but to put them into practice. So how do you translate ideas into action? The ability to integrate ideas across disciplines, the ability to recognize and navigate the complexity and messiness of real-world problems as they come up. I think the notion of taking risks, how to fail and how to come back, how to be resilient. And I think also the context of collaboration. How to balance both individual thinking, thinking as an individual, being able to solve problems independently, but also being able to solve problems as a team, as a group, and to navigate the dynamics of working with others, and especially working with others who are unlike yourself. And there are many avenues, I think, within a liberal arts college, and I think both avenues within the classroom in terms of pedagogical approaches that can be taken, as well as complementary experiences, which I think are increasingly essential if we want to enable and empower students to develop along all of these axes. And some of them were just discussed. I think on the pedagogical front, the role of undergraduate research and the sciences, I think, offer a really great model here on the power of undergraduate research to help students to nurture that ability to put ideas into action, nurture the ability to work together in teams, because typically the research is inherently collaborative, to nurture the notion of dealing with complexity and the idea that problems don't come in nice compartmentalized packages as they often do in courses, but they cross a broad range of disciplinary perspectives and require flexibility and agility in order to integrate those. And I think the model of translating the undergraduate research experience, which flourishes in the sciences, to the social sciences and humanities and the arts, has a great deal of potential to change the ways in which students are learning across the disciplines. A second pedagogical approach, which I was also exposed to for the first time here at Swarthmore, is the notion of community-based learning and the integration of collaboration with outside organizations, whether social service organizations or governmental organizations, other private groups, in collaboration with faculty members as a part of the teaching. And here again, there presents the opportunity for students to have to think about problem solving in a complex context, to solve problems that involve working with others, to take risks, and to also recognize the important interdisciplinary nature of work going ahead. You know, another area, though, outside of the classroom that I think is important, and this crosses some of those other two areas or other two pedagogical approaches, is this, what I like to call the sense of performance. And we can think of performance in the context of the arts, as Dr. Campbell was discussing earlier. You can also think of performance, though, as it happens in a range of places, you know, where students or others have to present their work, present their ideas, where they actually have to display them in some sort of professional context, where there are stakes that are different stakes than the stakes where you do an exam or write a paper, right? Because there's always the sense when you're taking an exam or writing a paper that, you know, the stakes are really a grade that can be an A or B or C. You know, there's a time, though, where you think of a performance where the stakes are actually, you know, perform or not perform, to put your work out there according to a more you know, sort of well-defined criteria or standard that you're aiming for. And I think creating opportunities for students to engage in that type of sort of higher stakes or performance concept of presenting their work is absolutely essential to nurture student development. And just one final thing I wanted to touch upon is, and this also relates to the concept of integration of things such as the arts throughout the curriculum, and ways in which that can be used to give this sense of professional performance as part of the student learning experience, and to give the notion of putting abstract ideas into practice. You know, one thing which I think has been a very powerful pedagogical technique, one that I know was used quite a bit at Oberlin at the time I was there, that we are working on at Kenyon as well, is how to use material culture and museums as tools to integrate across the curriculum. You know, what happens when you take a biology class and you go into the museum, and the museum becomes the laboratory for that afternoon, and you, first of all, you take the science students out of their natural comfort zone, you challenge them to look at the world in a slightly different way. You engage in a different type of learning in terms of the integration of visual culture and analysis in terms of analyzing an object. And you begin to fertilize or to generate connections between the arts, the sciences, the humanities that can happen in quite a powerful way. And so I think that type of integration of the arts, of visual culture, of other institutions throughout the curriculum, as well as opportunities for internships and professional opportunities in these areas that can be connected to curricular experiences that support all of these goals of, you know, I think the broader goals of liberal education. That's the frontier, as I see it, of where colleges are going. I think I know many of those things were beginning or in place when I was here at Swarthmore. I think they're continuing to develop, and as time goes on, they're going to be much more of the core of what the liberal arts education experience is about.
So it's great to be here. It reminds me of being a student at Swarthmore, and the power of being with people trained in different disciplines who think very different ways, and the sad fact that as you go on in your career, you get narrower and narrower and hang out with people who are trained the way you are, and it's wonderful to be back, so thank you. I want to talk about a disconnect that I've observed from the point of view that maybe is most relevant to social science, but I'll leave that to you to decide. So at Wagner, the Swarthmore grads who came there, or the graduates of other strong liberal arts colleges, were of course incredibly well prepared academically. They knew how to think, they knew how to write, they knew how to critique. There were no issues there. But they were not necessarily clear about how to connect what they knew to what they wanted to do. And that's the part I want to talk about here. Like Swarthmore, Wagner was a reflective place, always asking what we could do better. We started out with this notion that we had rigorous graduate coursework to offer. We had a talented faculty, a commitment to learning from both theory and practice, which you hear throughout these conversations, a school located in New York City, so students could intern or work in virtually any field and change their minds 4 or 5 times during 2 years. We had developed an approach to career planning that we called Composing Your Career, with a nod to Mary Catherine Bateson's terrific book titled Composing a Life. But there was something missing, and we were curious to figure out what it was. So we hired the design, thinking, and innovation firm called IDEO to help us enhance the student experience. And what they found, I think, has an applicability to the question we're trying to struggle with here. So we had been thinking about our students by their program. The equivalent would be their major here, whether they were studying public policy and management, or health policy, or urban planning. And we thought about them by their status, whether they were part-time or full-time, what semester they were in, how far along they were. And we designed then all our student support around those categories. And IDEO helped us see the limits of that approach. They encourage us instead to look at our students behaviorally and in terms of their orientation to the learning about careers, both in terms of their motivation for coming to grad school and the level of clarity they had about professional aspirations while they were in grad school. So they divided our students into 3 categories. The surveyors, whom sadly we used to call the clueless, but they came wide open, right? They had a passion for public service, but really not much of an idea about what to do with it. And they were very eager for guidance. And the ones who had come from good liberal arts schools were used to being very well held by their faculty and the staff, expected that level of attention from us, and really wanted us to direct them in terms of what courses they should take, what internships they should do, how they should begin their professional life. The explorers had a couple of ideas in mind. They thought, well, maybe they wanted to do urban education, or maybe they wanted to do child welfare, but they had a few paths they were exploring. They knew what issue areas resonated with them, and they relied on their peers. They used online resources, they looked around, they saw what other people were doing, and they could navigate grad school pretty much on their own, and they looked to us as a safety net, like just to make sure they weren't making any big mistakes, but they could maneuver reasonably well. And the navigators came, and they had a direct path. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. They knew what courses they needed. They wanted us to get out of their way and let them just proceed to graduation. So we found this framework incredibly useful. It not only made sense of what we had intuited or what we were puzzled by, but it helped us reorganize our student services. It helped us help faculty do advisement. But what we did at Wagner with those categories isn't so much the point here. I want to explore how this frame might offer lessons to liberal arts colleges. So it seems to me the lessons come in 2 dimensions. The first is what liberal arts colleges already do well and need to do more of. And that is that it's a perfect environment for surveyors, right? This is just the moment in which people should be looking broadly, trying to figure out what they want to do, what they're interested in, what their talents are, where their strengths are. But it's also a good place for explorers and navigators who sometimes need to be interrogated about the surety of their positions, and sometimes discover new fields or new interests and change their minds. Of course, it's a place for both depth and breadth, and it's a place to go to develop a life of the mind and habits of learning. But I think what colleges, liberal arts colleges could do better is that they can articulate the case not just for liberal arts education, but by probing the career paths of graduates, not just their final roles, they could help the world build a more sophisticated understanding of career pathways and how people move from a first job and an early experience, often through grad school, into 5, 6, 10, 15 different opportunities. They could move students from being surveyors to at least explorers, where the students have at least a few hunches about how to connect their interests to a starting job and a direction for career development. And they could shift the responsibility from career development from advisor to student, where it belongs. Not just because grad schools, especially professional schools, are less prepared to coddle students, but because students need to build these skills, to build this muscle, and they need to start building it in college. And finally, they could invent more imaginative and more porous career service offices. They could hire staff who have broad experience themselves, who've changed jobs a few times, who have wide networks, who look ahead. It seems to me too many college career offices have a very limited view of options. They continue to send people to law school because it's the place to go if you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. Not really a brilliant idea. And the limit, I think, is a fault compounded by faculty who feel somehow more affirmed if their students follow the path they chose themselves. For careers in public service, I wish there were better maps and clearer paths, but for now they have to be constructed inductively, and I think liberal arts colleges could help us in this way. And maybe this is really the point, that the narrow focus on return on investment will have to fail. Not just because Obama himself would have come out on the losing end of that stick because he worked as a community organizer for all those years and didn't make money, but because the arc of careers these days, especially for those with great talent, are not linear. They're not predictable. They're not easily imagined at 22 or even 32. Composing a career is truly the work of a lifetime, and liberal arts colleges need to make that lesson very clear for students. I want to wrap up by saying that I was intrigued that there's something called a liberal arts life. It had never occurred to me quite before. And I'm not sure I understand what it is, although I aspire even at my stage in life to live one. And let's hope that trying to make a difference in the world, sprinkled with summers in Italy, dabbling in painting, and a network of close friends and colleagues better read than I, are beginning to that goal. So thank you.
So Philip, who's probably trying to recruit lots of students to come to law school still, what's your future?
So at this point in the program, there's this wonderful comments. It's often said that everything that has to be said has been said, but not everyone has yet said it. I have a few neat points to add and also some gloss. And I, like many people would often say, I agree with everything said before me, except Ellen helped to give me something to disagree with. Both the facts, which is that nationwide the last 4 years, applications to law school are down 45%. This is a good thing. And that what's good about that is people going to law school are more purposeful than ever about why they're going. And it's very important to think about what the experience is, whatever it is, and why it's valuable, and whatever you might do. And it's interesting about the comments today is how they cut across different dimensions from different people. And I thought Erin Campbell gave a really wonderful opening to that, and many things have been said I'll try to touch on in 3 points. The first point, which is really important, is the across boundaries. And there's a great scientist, entrepreneur, Bill Joy, helped start Sun Microsystems, and the phrase Joy's Law is named in his honor, which means the smartest person working on a problem relevant to you is not in your organization. And so that creates a really interesting challenge, which open source development has provided one type of solution for, which is putting challenges out there, letting people work on them. And Linus Torvalds, who helped develop the core for Linux, had an idea that he also got to belong to him, and he said, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And that means getting more people looking at a problem from different angles. And when you have these challenges to solve problems, amazingly, some of the best solutions have not come from people in the discipline that was trying to solve the problem, which raises some very interesting questions about how problems get solved and who's situated to solve them. And the extent people do get focused in a silo-like manner in whatever world they're in, it does not serve them, the strongest one, as a creative problem solver. So how do we get outside of those boundaries, develop collaboration, and as Mary Campbell said, have exercises in imagination. That is a discipline that really is hard to develop and very important. I thought one thing Ellen said that I really liked a lot was design-centered thinking, and I think both Ellen and Sean have talked about empathy a little bit too, which is, again, getting outside yourself and looking at a situation from a broader horizon is really valuable, not easy to do. And one of the challenges is how do you get the self-awareness and space for that. And I also thought it was wonderful that Mary Campbell opened up with fail. Accept failure. This is something that lawyers sometimes don't do as well as we need to, which is we don't have to be perfect all the time. We have to be willing to try things, experiment, and sometimes they work, sometimes they won't. Getting better at accepting failure is a part of life. Now, the second point I want to make, other than getting across boundaries, is the reality that our world is moving faster than ever before. And Ellen's point about careers changing, adaptability, that we have to be able to move in different ways. And one of the virtues of, at its best, the legal education is it does give people the toolkit for that. Like liberal arts colleges, law schools have not always served people well by having a career services mindset that was too limited. And so one of the important recognitions for today's world is how many different jobs people are going to have. And that is not a linear process. It's not always predictable. And so that is a level of acceptance of a fast-moving world that is hard to prepare people for, particularly because you have to both prepare people at the same time to be in a faster-moving world and to resist those pressures and create more time and space for reflection. Because the idea that everything has to be moving faster all the time, and obviously social media plays a huge role here, is at odds with some of the values of a liberal arts experience that give people time for deliberation and reflection. And so how to both adapt to that world, recognize the pressures it creates, and yet resist at the same time is a second formidable challenge. Now the third point, we'll go back to part of what my Swarthmore experience was, and maybe the hardest, which is integrating two different dualities. One is humility, and by that I would say a growth mindset. When I was at Swarthmore, I knew a lot more than I knew now. And I would have said and did say things like, oh, you know, such and such could never happen to me, or I would never imagine such and such happening. And then, of course, until these things happen, and then you learn more. So how to get into a growth mindset coming from humility at the same time as you have confidence to take the initiative and try things. Because humility that leads to self-doubt and paralysis is not empowering. At the same time, self-confidence and taking the initiative that is not tempered by knowing what you don't know is going to get you in trouble. And so developing the mindset that's both a growth mindset and one that appreciates humility may be the most formidable challenge in some ways to take on whatever life will bring.
Terrific. I think we all should applaud. And let me first turn to the panelists and see if there's any cross-conversation.
Well, I think Philip did a beautiful job of sort of connecting the points. I think we should probably turn to the group and see what they want us to talk about.
Okay, let's see if there are questions, comments. I see Paul Rablin.
So, something that a lot of you touched on, and Mary Campbell did too, was sort of this the importance of taking risks. But one of the things I also see with today's students, and I can sympathize with where they're coming from because of the competitiveness of the world today. But I find that they're increasingly anxious about grades, and I find that increasingly sort of concern about grades seems to be it can get in the way of learning. And I guess I just wondered if what are some of your thoughts on how grading and the anxiety about grading is in part related to the competitiveness of getting into graduate programs and getting jobs and so on and so forth. How that how we resolve that tension with the benefits of risk taking.
Good. Let me just rephrase the question because we are video casting this. So panelists talked a lot about taking risks. Mary Campbell did too, the imagination risks. And yet current students are often very anxious. They're very worried about grades. They want to get into graduate school. So I guess, how do you resolve the current student's psyche with the kind of risks you see them needing to take?
Maybe if I could chime in with one thing, that it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the student learning is happening outside of our classrooms, right? And when I look back on my college experience and where I learned to take risks, or where I was taking risks, it was actually in work that I was doing that wasn't connected to things that involved grades at all. And I think that happens in a lot of places across our campuses, in the types of leadership roles that students have in student organizations, I think in activist work that students may do, I think in engagement with the surrounding community, that those are places, because in fact they're happening outside of the context of things that are simply graded, and actually happen also in contexts where there are very different sets of stakes involved that are not grades, but actually things that do have a chance of failure, that I think the notion of cultivating an ability to take risks happens. And so, it's that interface between the curricular side of things and the co-curricular side of things that, and that as we can nurture the connections there, I think we can help to translate or help students transfer some of that learning that's happening outside of the classroom to what's going on inside of the classroom.
I also learned at lunch that Swarthmore's first semester is pass-fail, and that I think, if I have this right, that there are 4 other courses during the college career that you can take pass-fail. So I think that speaks to some of these issues. I also, once you get out of grad school, no one cares what your grades were. No one, as far as I can tell.
So, okay.
But yeah, my recommendation is do less grading. I mean, if I could get rid of it entirely, actually, I would be happy. And replace it with, measurable goals and assessment that students could understand, and they could understand the relationship between, the work that they're doing and how it is that you're reacting to and evaluating it, and also make it less of a mystery to them, which I think particularly you can say, and as you get out of the quantitative into the qualitative disciplines, there's a kind of mystery and anxiety because they don't really understand what the difference is between A work and B work. So again, the more that it can be specified, here it is what I want you to do, did you do it, did you do it well, and they can understand that. I think it makes a huge difference. But I'd be happy to stop doing it.
So let me say a few things on this. First off, the way Google hires now is they throw out the transcript to start with.
Yes.
Okay? So they recognize that the competencies, this is a version of Sean's point, that are important aren't reflected on the grades that people are getting. And for students who focus only on their grades, to say what Sean said in a different way, that's showing a lack of imagination about the experience. And they'll be better served by a mindset that is self-conscious about what are the competencies they're developing while they're here. Some of which may happen to be with professors. Some of those professors' interactions may be outside the classroom. Some of my best interactions with professors included people like Barry Schwartz, who I never really took a class from. And so the experience to me at Swarthmore, you've already won by getting into Swarthmore and graduating from Swarthmore. What's going to be impactful from your experience will be not defined by your grades. And so it's hard to say that when you're the teacher in the class, because that's the mindset they're in. But the message to get to students is that the richness of the experience is not going to be about the grades. And future employers and graduate programs are increasingly getting that. They're looking for competencies that are not defined by grades, so students shouldn't have a tunnel vision and narrow their imagination.
So you really would support Ellen's suggestion, too, that we need to do more by helping our students be able to make their skills specific.
Yes, I think actually, as strong as my experience was with professors like Richard Rubin or Barry Schwartz, that was how weak the career services counseling was. There was no effort to actually articulate what are the competencies that they could look at a resume, but never would they say, okay, you've really become good at taking the initiative or leadership. These are the sorts of things you can keep doing to,
mind your, look at your growth, and here's things you might consider. That experience wasn't part of my Swarthmore experience. That only came later.
Right. And I think we've all built out our career services, but it's still got to be more of a partnership probably between the faculty and career services. Tim Burke.
Yeah, so Rebecca started me thinking about something, and I think the panel really helped me think even more about it overall. And that is, okay, so this notion of, say, the humanities are really in a way what's being talked about when the liberal arts are being targeted, and that the humanities have work. I mean, we can do work, and it isn't just the stereotypical we talk good, kind of thing, but there's something else. My colleagues know I'm fond of pointing to the early history of artificial intelligence and saying, if the guys who thought that was an easy problem had listened to philosophers of mind back then, we'd have a different history maybe. But then there's this other challenge that if they had listened to them and the philosophers of mind were asked to join the team, there would be a decent number of them back then who would have said, well, actually, I don't just think it's a hard problem, I think you shouldn't do it. Right? So working would mean in some cases being willing to pitch in despite worries about the instrumental objectives of work, and to see what we can do. But it makes me realize that maybe what's at stake in liberal arts and why we're being targeted in some ways now is an old ideology of work that says work is about efficiencies. Work is about managing human resources to produce the most in the least time, and with the least expense. And then maybe, the real world of new work, especially, I think, digital media, but lots of other things, open source, lots of things are showing us inefficiencies, extravagances might actually be in many ways the best way to create, really powerful, valuable, great capitalist, et cetera, outcomes. And so I wonder if what we're really fighting against is almost an old ideology of middle management that says, no, I need my team and it's got to be the 4 guys who can do this quickly, and I don't want the humanists screwing it up and asking me about hermeneutics.
Asking questions.
And maybe that's what we have to say, is good work is actually inefficient work in lots of ways.
So let me try to rephrase that. It's okay. I've had this practice. I've practiced it. So I'll say it simply that Tim, I think, saw in Rebecca's comments this opening that maybe the problem is in part the way we conceived work, that the humanities is not practical, it doesn't work, because our image of work is this highly efficient, bureaucratic, kind of 20th century, make it easy, make it tight, kind of make it siloed. Maybe what's happening with what Philip and everybody else is describing is a whole different vision of work.
Well,
Close enough?
Let me start, and I'll take Rebecca's point about the whatever Obama chart return on investment framework. Swarthmore did a good job instilling me with the right of value. So after I clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court, when lots of my colleagues were looking at how much money they could make, one of them turned to me and said, "Gosh, Bill, you're talking about you're really good at the low-paying jobs." Well, and I think the mistake of doing things for money, which is a version of how work can be defined, is a trap. That's also limiting your imagination. For all of the careers that we all have, it's a long game. And if you play it as if it's a short game, you're missing a lot, and you're going to underinvest in all sorts of experience and opportunity. So take Steve Jobs, for example. When he looked back at his career, he spent time in India, he spent time with design, and those came in really powerful ways to help him be more effective. If we try too much in a short-sighted way to look for what another person who I knew some called the big green, which I think is, when you talk about efficiency, that's one take, but another, it's looking at things only through a certain lens that is a narrow lens. And ironically, some people end up being very successful financially. It wasn't because they chose to take that short route that seemed that way. It's they took a different sort of path. So I think there are pressures. I'm not sure all the reasons why they're getting, exerted. That's a good question worth reflecting on. But I will say, for people who are able to build a longer, richer perspective, I do believe they'll be rewarded for it.
Yeah. And let me just say, I think this point is absolutely essential. that, I mean, I made reference in my remarks to the vast and I think growing economy of work that is now creative, interdisciplinary, that really does draw on and it is informed by thinking across boundaries, informed by notions of design, the visual, some of the things that Mary Campbell was talking about. And this world is growing, and part of it is actually because of that so many of us now live our life through the internet and through the screen and through our lives through media. And this has exploded, I think, in many ways, the ways in which now work is being redefined. So I think it's an absolutely critical point, and a moment where humanists as well as artists, and where I'm making it's a distinction, but we live in the same world, that can really, this is our moment, in some sense. This is our moment, if we can seize it and we can recognize it and we make it happen, rather than just retreating, as you said, to, well, we live on the edges and that's where we're comfortable, or we retreat to our towers. This is the moment not to do that.
And it seems so important also to help explain that from an admissions point of view, that this is the reality to our alumni and also to the general public. I mean, this is a pushback, but also a contribution we could make. Sean.
Oh, I'm just going to add to that. You can put this in the context of technology and the way technology is transforming concepts of efficiency and work very broadly. And I think that the path of reducing everything down to efficiency begins to break down as something to pursue intellectually or coming out as an outcome of education, in part because we're at a point where technology and automation are going to make anything that can be incredibly efficient, not only moving very quickly, but probably without people at all at some point. So the long-term hopes for things are not necessarily the person who can function most efficiently, because probably there's going to be a machine that can actually function to do that process most efficiently in the end. It's who can assemble on a level of complexity and assemble pieces of processes and understand a higher order of work that needs to be done, that's really going to require human capital in the end. And so that to me ties directly into what we're describing as a liberal education.
Okay. Ellen?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so I kind of get back to one of the comments Philip made. You've already won by getting this work more. So how do you ensure the future of liberal arts at places that aren't Swarthmore?
Great. So to go back to the comment that in a way you've already won if you get admitted to Swarthmore, how do we ensure the future of places that aren't Swarthmore?
So the economics of higher education are very challenging, and you don't see a lot of new Swarthmores getting developed. And the challenge is, in a world where the pressures you do more efficiently, so think moves, how to create the experience of the kind that I and Sean talked about that made this experience for us so meaningful. David Brooks had one of the best pieces on moves that he called the Practical University, which said for experiences in college where every class is 400 people and you don't have any of that interaction, MOOCs challenge you in the right way to come up with collaboration, imagination, working across boundaries. And so the challenge for schools like the one that I'm at, University of Colorado at Boulder, is how to do a good job developing those experiences without the architecture and tradition that Swarthmore has that makes that so easy for people. And that is a real challenge, and it's one that we have to find ways to meet in tougher climates than probably ever before for higher education.
One other way to think about this is that if we look specifically at small private residential liberal arts colleges, collectively we are a tiny slice of the overall higher education pie. And because of that, and I think we're starting to see this in the way colleges are interacting, that there's much more to be gained by being collaborative rather than competitive, and there are many avenues in which good communication and collaboration, or at least exploration of collaboration between liberal arts colleges is something that we should pursue, because, you know, I'm more concerned about the shrinking of that slice of the pie in terms of the broader public interest and engagement in coming to institutions like Swarthmore than I am in a specific Swarthmore versus Kenyon competition. You know, and I think that's the, you know, there's going to be an increasing need for us to think collaboratively across institutions.
I will say, just to add finally though, there's an interesting irony here that there is one, you find the phenomenon of the birth of new liberal arts colleges actually globally. That at the same time as here in the US, there is this continuing pressure on economic and also, I think, ideological pressure on the future of the liberal arts that you see in, you know, in India, in China, in the UK, you know, in Europe. The people come and say, we want to understand how to build the model of a liberal arts education in these places that have always been driven by more vocationally driven educational models. So there's a recognition globally that what we've got here is something unique and extraordinary that has been an engine for creativity and in every aspect, in every kind of work, and that globally you find this increasing interest in the adopting of the liberal arts model. So something is interesting is happening here in terms of the global spread of the model at the same time as it's under pressure in our own country.
Also, I want to go back to Philip's point, because you can have a liberal arts education in a large university. You get a particular flavor of it here, and it's delicious and special and wonderful, and we want it to continue. But it isn't the only place. And I do think the challenge is to figure out at NYU or Colorado or other places how to create micro-communities, how to create small enough experiences for people, and how to connect, in particular, their outside of the classroom experiences with their own development, so that they can get both the breadth and the depth that we all got here.
So I would also add, I would underscore the importance of collaboration. I think there are lots of new collaborations around the country. Tori Harding-Smith, who's on the next panel, is helping some of us in Pennsylvania do a Pennsylvania Liberal Arts Consortium. I know your Kenyon is part of one. And those are very important to all of us. They're certainly important for schools that aren't Swarthmore. I think second, the ambassadorial role that we can all play. I think we have to help the public understand that these are important treasures in American culture, and that we need to do all we can to support them. I didn't get to a Swarthmore. I didn't know Swarthmore existed. I went to a small liberal arts college in the middle of Kansas, but it was a great school. I hope everybody in my state, home state, and that's a worrisome state right now, understands the importance of those small liberal arts colleges. But I also want to say, they're some of the most innovative places in the country right now. So I learned from my colleagues in schools like that a lot. They don't have the resources. They don't have the big libraries. They don't have the 8-to-1 student-faculty ratio. They're doing some incredibly creative things. So we shouldn't undersell them by any means. It's amazing what they're doing. But many of them are adding professional programs, nursing, business, etc. We can see that as the death of the liberal arts, or we may be able to use some of these ideas that we've been talking about in the panel to kind of reinvent a new way of understanding the liberal arts that help them survive in a new fashion. Yes, Art?
Well, we had a conversation here at Swarthmore about the Irish were interested in a liberal arts college within the university. So that's one way that Swarthmore can lead. But you know, to have a liberal arts history or continue liberal arts tradition doesn't require schools to be like Swarthmore. You know, a school that's charging $25,000 and has a student-faculty ratio of 15-to-1 is still just as much a liberal arts college as Swarthmore. And so, you know, it doesn't have to be as precious as what we have here. And I would ask, you know, when I was in school, we had 3 and 3 in terms of faculty teaching load, and now I guess there's 2 and 2. Was Swarthmore any worse because faculty taught more or was it better than now in terms of 2 and 2? So I mean, the model that happens to be emerging now doesn't have to be for everybody, and there are many variations that would still be quite viable.
Okay, I'll try to summarize briefly. Art and I've had many conversations about this, and I think it's an important point. There are lots of different models. There are lots of different models, not only the professional liberal arts model, but also faculty teaching more courses, larger courses, etc. So, any comments?
No, I think we have agreement.
Well, I'll say a little that explicates your point, which is the mindset of the students and the mindset of the faculty, and how do you create the place or the structure for that is the basic challenge, and there's not one formula for that. I will say one thing Swarthmore has that's very special is that collaboration across different disciplines and between faculty and students. And what some large universities have trouble with is both faculty tend to get more siloed and more separated from students. And so that's, to me, that's in a way the definition of liberal arts college. And, you know, in Colorado, one of our Nobel Prize laureates from prospective students. And that's very much in the liberal arts tradition. It's not necessarily encouraged by, you know, the structures where, you know, you have higher faculty, student-faculty ratios and less contact in different disciplines.
And I would just make one point following that about my concern and based in my own experience. You know, I think part of the power of small classes and 8:1 ratio is that it's not just the best students that get taught then. In large courses, or when faculty are teaching 6, 8 courses a semester or a year, it's often the very cream of the top academically that get the attention. So I think there's some real power. I mean, I don't think many students here fall through the safety net of the faculty. I think the faculty get to know very much all their students. So that is the downside of those models. Yes, Davia.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about this growing dichotomy between simplicity and a 140-character world of social media, and the complexity of liberal arts. And, you know, we seem to get very reductionist in part of our society. We're getting very reductionist. If I see one more business text on how important simplicity is, when we all know the world is growingly complex, it's frustrating. And I'm wondering, we've got these two balancing priorities going on in our culture, and I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about that and how we bring out the complexity in 140 characters.
Okay, the question is simplicity, complexity, the balance in 140 characters. How to do that?
Well, so if I could just speak to this, I mean, it's, I think I mentioned in my remarks that I am currently teaching a course, this goes back to integration, it's a course, co-teaching a course with a mathematician and a scholar of Islam on reality for a group of 80 very talented, you know, and ambitious freshmen. And so I'm teaching reality from the point of view of theater and film. Then the mathematician talks about reality in math, and the scholar of Islam. So this week I was talking about Euripides' Bacchae and the body. The scholar of Islam was talking about sort of religious items in Egypt, and the mathematician was talking about positive integers, which I think is totally cool. The kids were confused. The kids were not happy because the kids wanted simplicity. You know, and we're thrilled. We're having a blast in this class. The faculty are having a blast. But the students want simplicity, and they do, and you can see they feel uncomfortable, you know, and they're wanting us to do the work of saying, well, what does, you know, Pentheus's body have to do with positive integers to have to do with the Quran? And I think this is a real challenge. The only other thing is, and it also reminds me, so sort of put that on one side of the students who come, in which some of the hardest thing for them to take on is the understanding of moving from simplicity to complexity when they have to make their brains work really hard to do this, and it takes a while. And on the other side, the year that the time that I was doing freshman advising, I think it was the year in which Jerry Maguire was a popular film. I had my little cohort of freshman advisees, and 2 out of that cohort of 10 came into me for their first freshman advising session, sat down, looked at me and said, I want to go into sports management, what do I need to do? And so that's the other problem, you know, that now, again, this you can talk this as a Penn problem. But I think that's another issue that also goes back to some of the things that we were also talking about of life is seen, knowledge is seen as a one-way track, and life is seen as a one-way track, and complexity is hard. And so that's what part of what I think of a complexity is life is hard, but complexity in education is hard. And all our dreams of integration, it's actually not just hard institutionally, it's hard for the students.
And to build on that, I think from a student experience, you know, and developmentally for students, an understanding of the complexity has to emerge. It can't be presented. And you know, as an example, I was convinced when I was here as an undergraduate that I was going to do my senior honors thesis in chemistry on curing cancer. Right, that was the, and that seemed like a well-defined problem to me. And you know, clearly, I may not find it in the year, but I would make some progress and it would be done. And it was and I think that there's a degree to which, from a developmental standpoint, you have to actually be confronted with things that are difficult and challenging that then allow an understanding of the underlying complexity to emerge and how you approach it. And that actually means planning of and guiding of students through a range of experiences that can allow that to happen. And to just give one example at Kenyon, which I think is just an interesting model where we have students that are living on a farm, because we have lots of farms that surround us. And you know, these are students who are taking courses in a range of topics that touch on sustainability in agriculture. So they're, you know, for example, we're taking an anthropology course that's talking about, you know, history of relations between people and land and thinking about it in a cultural context. But they're also waking up at 5 in the morning and taking care of chickens and taking eggs, and they get used in the dining hall. And that, you know, I think that they are undergoing a process over a course of a year where they are going to be forming connections between these, you know, meta concepts that they're studying in class and what's happening in the practical details on the ground that you can't just present. They have to unfold over the course of time. And to come back to Phil's point, one of the challenges I think we face is that everyone is used to things moving at such a fast pace that there isn't the patience and time to build in to allow those connections to evolve. And it's that I feel one of our challenges is to fight against the notion that you have to do everything very quickly and in lockstep to make sure that we clear away space for those complex connections to emerge.
Okay, Kai?
So it occurs to me that there are a lot of things that are being talked about that are in tension. There's individuality, collaborativeness, there's complexity, simplicity, the feedback that's encapsulated in a grade versus the feedback of an applause with when you're on stage. So there are lots of things that are in tension here, but it seems to me that what drives the greatest tension structurally at institutions like Swarthmore, where I am Morehouse now, is what we think we ought to do, or what we think students ought to learn, versus a kind of what I, as a student, want to learn. And I'm wondering, you know, that goes not just as a big picture, you know, what the academic enterprise ought to look like for a student, but down into each classroom. You know, there are things that we think students ought to know, and so to move away from that, to structure a class where I'm going to throw them in, and I don't care that they get to this end point, but I'm going to bring students in, and what I'm going to connect with most importantly is what they want to do, what their sense of purpose is, connect with that passion, and move through to something. We have a difficult time as an institution fighting against that tension. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we actually break that structural bind.
Okay, among the many tensions that we have been talking about, there is a tension between what we feel we need to teach, what the end game is, what we want to happen in the classroom, as compared to the experience of the students coming in and what they want to learn, what they might think they need to learn. That's a kind of structural tension, structural bond.
So it occurred to that tension occurred to me in response to the question about complexity and simplicity, because I think that's the premise that we believe we have useful ideas about what students need to learn is the premise behind distribution requirements, or some notion that you can't, that this isn't a place where you can just come in and design your entire curriculum to meet your own version of what you want to learn in the moment. We actually think that you need to be challenged, whether it's as things get more and more complex, or that a well-rounded liberal arts education requires maybe linguistics instead of math, but it requires some capacity to know things beyond what you're immediately interested in, because later in life, this ability to make connections we believe is critical and important. So we stand behind the notion that we're entitled to have a point of view about what you want to learn, and I still believe that's true.
I'm particularly sensitive to this because I teach things that nobody wants to learn. Honestly, so Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, no, there's hardly a child on this earth who comes to college saying, I really want to get there so I can read Paradise Lost. I feel sorry for them, but so my job is, so it's an interesting thing. So structurally, you find ways to get them into the classroom to make them read Paradise Lost. But once you get them there, and again, this is what Gil Rose did, you make it seem like their lives have been transformed by having read. They didn't know it, but Paradise Lost was the most important thing that they could have read. And I'm not saying I pull this off for every kid, but I can pull it off because what they actually really, behind Paradise Lost, Milton Paradise Lost, stands the answer to everything. So if that's what they want, it may give the wrong answers to everything, but he gives the answers to everything. And so that's what, I think you really need to plug into.
And I think there's also, when I think about things that we as educators in this sector can improve upon, it's getting, working with our students more intentionally to explain why the curriculum is structured the way it is. And I think that takes time and connection and conversation through advising and other things. But I think often we assume that students have the bigger picture of why our curriculum has its structure and arc and why we're requiring what we're requiring. And we don't actually do the work to make that more intentional an explanation. And I think there's work for us to improve on that.
Okay, I saw another question. Yes, sir.
Well, this goes back to exporting Swarthmore, Kennedy, Bible, Kennedy transfer, in particular to public institutions. And my question has to do with how one nurtures a culture of commitment to student-faculty engagement, in particular in public institutions like CU. Bill is the only representative of a public institution here. I'm fortunate to teach at a small public liberal arts college in which the faculty have a sort of bottom-up culture of commitment to first-year seminars, much like the self-design concept design studio concept that I think is more Ivy incubators inside of my graduate work in Silicon Valley. And we have incredibly diverse first-year seminars where students are invited in the context of the passion of scholars. We have summer programs in which faculty work with 2 or 3 students on projects, 50 or 60 faculty at a time. We have wonderful internships. I take students to South Africa to study the way South Africans use education, entertainment, and health communication to fight gender violence and AIDS and so on. But how do you nurture not just occasional activities, but an entire culture of commitment among faculty to this kind of ongoing process, design studio concepts, idea incubator concepts, in particular in public institutions generally, but in particular in larger ones?
So let me just rephrase so that people who are all around the world can hear the question. How do you cultivate among the faculty especially, this commitment to IDEO, to design, to creativity in the classroom, especially in public institutions. But I think it would be good to extend it to privates too.
So it's a great question, thank you. And one thing Rebecca said earlier is we're saying, how do you extend it for all students? The very top students who actually make really good research assistants or teaching assistants are likely to get some versions of that. So how do you scale it in a larger population or even a smaller one? Well, one challenge here, and I know I speak for all of us in really being appreciative of Rebecca's leadership, is leadership matters. And so having someone at the top who cares about students and gets it matters. And having the message about the role of us as teachers engaged with our students really matters. Second, imagination and how you design the spaces to get, let's call it leverage, because you're not going to, do this if your student faculty ratio is like 30 to 1. So you have to bring in other people, and you have to think intentionally how to create these spaces and opportunities. So the University of Miami created a launch pad to help students who were on projects that were entrepreneurial bring the community in to help them as a way to get experiences that empower people. Because part of what I take from what Sean's saying is we have to empower our students about what they're doing. Because if it's a random walk until they graduate and they really haven't thought about designing their own experience, they're not going to graduate empowered. Whereas if you can give them a sense of purpose in what they're doing, and that is helped a lot by the environments that you're talking about, makes a big difference. So the right leadership and the right strategies take you a long way, but it's hard, and it's important that we keep an eye on that, because the types of experiences that people got, we heard about at NYU and the Tisch School, that's powerful. I mean, those students, having worked as a team to produce something, that's going to stay with them their whole lives. If we can do that for all of our students, it makes an enormous impact.
So I want to say something rude, which is that this is partly the challenge of having a tenured faculty. Mary's laughing, but if on one level your question is a question about organizational change and cultural change, and the answers are in leadership and rewards and structures, and it's a similar challenge in almost every organization you try to transform. But the particular challenge in higher ed is that you have faculty who can pride themselves on resisting being moved by any of these levers that in other organizations would seem powerful. And so I think this is really one of the reasons that higher ed, the national trends show a decrease in hiring tenured faculty. I don't think this is an issue on campuses like Swarthmore, but I do think it's a big issue across the country, and an increase in hiring contract faculty. I don't mean adjuncts, I don't mean people, I mean people who are well paid, but who are there because they want to teach and engage, and do research, potentially do research as well. But the incentive structures for contract faculty are more apparent, and their response is often more direct. And for people who are trying to lead higher ed institutions, it's a real conundrum.
Okay. We're almost at the end of our time, but let's go over here. Yes, please.
I think you're all in many ways preaching to the choir today. And I have a question, which is, I see societal attitudes which really push the students you talk about in this, not wanting complexity type direction. I'd like to see if any of you has any idea of how to address these attitudes that I think thwart intellectual brevity. I got 3. Number 1 is what I call license to think. We find that certain occupations, and I think engineers, calculus in high school in New Jersey. And she told me once that she was on a committee writing a curriculum or something like that, and all the English teachers there couldn't figure out why she could write good curriculum when she was a math teacher. So those are my 3 attitudes. If you guys can
Did you tweet that in 140 characters?
not even close.
Okay, so I'm just going to make this one really big and broad. How do we help change the attitudes of students that come in about fundamentally kind of how open their world is and how they can learn new experiences? And you can answer his question more directly. I was trying to summarize it.
Well, this was what Sean framed as a challenge about how do you give students the broader frame and mindset. And I guess we could say, in addition to career services, we have to think hard about orientation. Some institutions take orientation very seriously. Think about before people join the military. Most colleges or law schools can do better.
I would also say role models. We do a lot in bringing back our alumni from all sorts of different walks of life and careers who come from all sorts of unexpected places. So you can figure out how the English professor and how the English major ended up being the real estate magnate. How the biologist went to work for MTV. Whatever it is that you can find to. So I think we can start to break down some of those myths and the things that they believe and the stories that they've always been told, whether they derive them from the media or TV or for what it is that their parents say, that the more I find, the less that I talk and the more that we get real life stories and real life examples of what it is that people do in life, the more powerful they are for students.
Actually, I agree with that completely. And to echo something that Ellen pointed to earlier, I think we need to do a better job at articulating what the outcomes are of a liberal education in specific terms. So I think we need to be able to show what are the career paths after graduation, showing how they are complex, and to highlight, there have been a number of reports lately which have shown pretty explicitly that major is completely uncorrelated to career on the other end. So that for the majority of folks out there, you major in English, you go do something that is completely different than English out there. Some are actually going to be English teachers or English faculty or researchers. Others are going to go on and do vastly different things. I think those are data that are obtainable, and we need to do a better job of, I think, collecting them about our own institutions, of sharing them across institutions. And I think, as Rebecca said, being the ambassadors out there telling the story, because I think here's a case where the real story actually does, I think, have a pretty convincing case against the societal trends that you're identifying.
Right, and I would say that there are lots of societal trends with which we don't agree. And our work is to hold a more complex frame. It's to hold a more sympathetic frame. And it's to go back to Philip's point, it's to think about the long game, because these people got themselves in that mindset because they thought about the immediate future. And one of the benefits of the education we've all had is it helps us think about the long-term future.
Okay, we're going to take a very brief break and then come back for this next fabulous panel, and then we'll have a long reception. But now you get to see what a wonderful job I have, because I get to talk to Swarthmore alumni all the time. Thank you.
Thank you.